Okay, so this lecture is for getting the toolbox installed. That means you're using Windows 10 Home or one of the older versions of Windows like 7, 8, or 8.1. And even though the toolbox is legacy, it's still got some pretty cool features. So in this lecture, we're going to actually download, install it. Then we're going to clone my GitHub repo. Then we're going to start the Quick Start Terminal, and that is actually the command line interface that Docker gives you for the toolbox. And then we're going to maybe tweak some of the VM settings, or at least show you how to do that. And finally, getting a code editor and seeing how we might change the shell out. So maybe you can use a different shell instead of the default command prompt that comes with Windows. All right, as you can see, I'm on a Windows 8 machine, actually 8.1. And I'm actually already on store.docker.com. And like all the other editions of Docker, this is where you get it. So for Windows, we're under Docker CE. And then we scroll down till we find Windows. Now for the toolbox, it's not the default option. So if you notice up here at the top, it talks about that it needs Windows Professional 10 or Enterprise. And then there's, for previous versions, get Docker Toolbox. So let's click on that. And that will take us to a previous site where you could actually get stuff from Docker, which was on the docker.com site. And this is where the toolbox is living for now. Eventually, it may go and live in the store, but you just download the one for Windows. It's the same one for all versions of Windows. And I happen to already have that downloaded. So right here, just run that install, and it'll walk you through the setup. Now, I recommend you do a full install here. So on all the options you want checked. And in my case, I actually already have it installed, so it didn't check them all by default. But for yours, it should have them all checked. You want VirtualBox because that's how it's going to run the Linux VM in the background that's actually going to run Docker for us. And the Git for Windows allows us to actually have a bash prompt that will make it seem a little bit more like Linux or Mac when we're using Docker. So let's say now that I've finished my Docker install, and I'm going to double click the Docker Quick Start, and that will automatically kick off the initialization process. And what that looks like is that you'll see that it's running something called the pre-create checks, and it's actually creating a VirtualBox VM, and it's using a boot to Docker ISO to do that, which is a very small version of Linux. Then you see that it's provisioning from networking. Now it's probably going to prompt you a couple times for permissions. That's totally normal. That's a VirtualBox thing. But eventually, it'll get down to where you see that the Mobi in ASCII format. And that's a signal that it's working. And you'll see that it's giving me a default machine IP of 192.168.99.100. And remember that this is in the resource lecture earlier in this section. Now, I'm going to clone this, but I want to clone it in desktop. If you've never used GitHub before, then you can use a GUI, and that's probably one of the easiest ways if you're not used to GitHub. If you know GitHub, then you got your own way to do it. But here, what I can do is I can actually use the GitHub GUI to download and clone my repo. So I'm going to install that. All right, and then I'm actually going to put all of my code in a directory called code. So I'm going to make a directory. So you'll see on my machine that I actually put all of my software code inside a directory called code underneath my user. So that's where I'm going to clone this from GitHub at. So I'm just going to log in as me. Okay, now that I have GitHub installed, one of the ways I can clone it is from the website. I can copy the URL, and then go back over to desktop and say clone a repository, copy that in. And then remember, I wanted to, this is not going to be under documents, it's going to be under code. That's where I put my stuff. So clone. Now the advantage of doing it this way instead of downloading the zip is that you can come in here and update it, because I do update this repo when there's fixes or changes in Docker, which happens pretty much every month. So now if I do a dir in here, you can see that I'm in the Docker, the Udemy Docker mastery directory, and there we go. The last thing I just want to point out is you'll need a code editor of some sort. It's not that great to use Notepad, even though it does work. So I recommend Visual Studio Code. It's a free editor from Microsoft, and you can get it over just by Googling Visual Studio Code, and it's free to download. Runs on Mac, Windows, and Linux, and actually it's running on the Atom platform if you've ever played with Atom, which is another editor from GitHub. But this one actually has a nice add-on for Docker and a lot of other nice features that I think really are great out of the box. So download that. You might see me use it a couple times during the course, and there you go. What's happening in the background here is VirtualBox is actually running silently. And you don't see the GUI necessarily, but it doesn't mean it's not running. It's actually sitting here running what was automatically created, which was a default machine. So this is actually just a regular VM running Linux. Even though it is a small and limited version of Linux that Docker installed, you can change the properties of it, especially when it comes to the hardware. So I can't change anything right now because it's running, so I could do a shutdown here, and then once it's shut down, I could actually go in and change settings like how many CPUs it has access to or how much RAM it has access to. And that's really just dependent upon your system and how many resources you have. So for example, by default, it gives it a gig of RAM and a single processor. Maybe I want to bump it up to 2, and maybe I want to give it 2 gigs of RAM. So I can just bump that up, something like that, and then click OK. And then I could start it from here, but we also can control it from something called Docker Machine. And there will be a later lecture on what Docker Machine can do, but fundamentally, Docker Machine creates VMs either in the cloud or on your local machine that run Docker. If I just do a Docker Machine ls here, you'll see that it sees the machine that it's automatically created, and the first machine it creates, it always creates as default, and I could actually start it with Docker Machine start. And you'll see that it'll actually kick it off here. And so I don't ever really need to use Oracle VM VirtualBox Manager. I don't actually have to play with that at all unless I want to change the hardware settings. So now while that's starting and getting its IP again so that we can mess with it, I want to talk a little bit about this Quick Start Terminal. So this is actually the default way. You need to run this at least once because then it's going to automatically create that default machine. It's automatically going to set it up and do the networking for you. But after that, you don't have to use it. You can, as long as you can get the Docker machine from somewhere, you can run Docker machine in the Docker command line. If you're a little bit more savvy user and you want to do a custom command line or a custom shell and terminal, you can try commander cmder.net, and it really just changes the GUI and the functionality around that GUI. It's still inside it running PowerShell or Command Prompt or Bash, but it does give you a lot of features around the GUI. I recommend downloading and extracting the full version, and when you do that, make sure that you right-click on the zip file and go into Properties and unblock it, because once you unzip it, it doesn't actually have an installer. You just need to unzip it, and once you unzip it, it won't run without a bunch of warnings and problems unless you unlock it first, because it considers that a security feature in Windows. You've probably run into that before. So extract all that. You can extract it right into your downloads folder. That's what I do. And then inside Commander, you'll see something called Commander. And if you simply run that, by default, it'll give you a command prompt, a cmd.exe. And you'll see that you have some cool options here where I can actually run a PowerShell prompt if I want. I can run multiple tabs and a lot of other nice features where I can actually expand it and shrink it at will. And that's great. But how do we get Docker running in that? Well, it's not that hard. It just takes a few extra steps. So you can see over here that I have Docker machine ls, and that shows me that I have one machine with Docker running. And as you'll learn in future lectures in the next section, I can do a Docker version that will tell me the Docker version of both my client and the server running in the background. But over here, I can do Docker machine, and I can do Docker version. But you'll notice that it says it can't connect to server. And that's a common problem on Windows or on the toolbox specifically. And what that means is that Docker isn't actually running in Windows. It's running in the VM. And so my client, my little command line Docker right here, can't talk to that unless I tell it where to go. And that's one of the things this nice little GUI over here does that I need to set up over here. And the way we do that is with Docker machine. So if I just do Docker machine ls again, you see that it has the one machine there. And if I do a Docker machine help, I get lots of help, right? Get lots of information. And one of the things I can do here is I can type Docker machine env default, because remember that's the name of the default machine. And that will actually get me some variables that I can then copy and paste into my host. But it actually tells me down here at the bottom that if I just do this, it should work. So let me copy and paste that. And now what should happen if I do a Docker version, I get back both the client and the server. Now, if you're savvy enough with Commander, you can actually have it do that stuff automatically on startup. I'll leave that to you. Otherwise, just know that you can use the Docker machine env default to get the commands you need in order to tell Docker how to find the server. And then once it can find it, you can do all the Docker commands that come in to later lectures. In this lecture, you learned how to get the Docker toolbox on older versions of Windows. And I just want to give you a couple extra tips and summarize some of the things we talked about real quick. The Docker Quick Start Terminal is how you start it. So remember, you need to run that once in order for it to automatically create the default machine and get everything set up. You can still actually use Docker machine after that to manipulate that Docker machine in the background, but that actually defaults to the bash shell and auto creates everything for you. Do note that during this course, we're going to talk about something called a bind mount, and that's where it connects source files that you've downloaded on your Windows machine into the Docker Linux machine, okay? And that's known as a bind mount. That actually works with the toolbox, but it's only going to work for code that you stored inside the users directory. So make sure that you, whenever you get downloads of code, you actually make sure that they're in your user profile and not somewhere else on a different drive letter. Unfortunately, different drive letters and different paths will not work with the toolbox. They have to be in your user profile. This also is a good thing that you don't use for databases. So I don't recommend that you do a bind mount, and again, we'll explain the details of that later, but that you do a bind mount for databases. It's really just for code, because Windows file systems are quite different than Linux file systems, and they don't always work well together when they're sharing. And again, remember that you can always use Docker machine to actually recreate that Linux VM that it created for you, the default one, right? Or additional ones. And the great editor that I recommend is Visual Studio Code in this course. And that if you would like a shell replacement, you might want to consider Commander, and you can get that at cmder.net.